Hi, everyone. Good morning and welcome to the third day of the 26th International Interdisciplinary Conference on the Environment. I am pleased to welcome to the stage Dr. Meenal Shrivastava. Dr. Meenal Shrivastava is a scholar trained in literature, history, and political economy. She examines globalization as a description, a process, as well as an ideology along a historical continuum of movement, humans, ideas, institutions, commodities, and technologies. Her research has so far led to the publication of 3 books, Right and Power, an anthology of the personal and the political, Amma's Daughters, a memoir, and Alberta Oil and the Decline of Democracy in Canada, and more than 150 articles, book chapters, papers, and opinion pieces. She also serves on the boards of several academic journals and associations in Canada, US, and South Africa. Raised in India, she began her academic career in South Africa immediately following its transition from apartheid state to a democracy. For the past 15 years, she has lived in Canada during a period of acknowledgement and conciliation with its colonial history. Realizing that stories are a powerful tool of intellectual stimulation and emotional persuasion to counter their pervasive othering and hate baiting in the post-truth era, she added creative nonfiction to her academic writings. As one born with caste and class privilege to now being an immigrant of color on Indigenous lands, she writes from the liminal spaces of her various identities. Please welcome Dr. Meenal Shrivastava.
Thank you so much, Olivia. And it's a pleasure to be here this morning from the Coast Salish territory. Thank you to IEF and the Honor Society for inviting me to deliver this special keynote. It's really great to be with some old friends and hopefully to make some new friends. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm located in the unceded Coast Salish territory, home to the Wasanich peoples, whose historical relationship with the land continues to this day, and in whose traditional territories I live on and work from my home office for Athabasca University, which is located on Treaty 6, the traditional territory of the Plains Cree, Woodland Cree, Beaver Cree, Saulteaux, Niitsitapi, Métis, and the Nakota Sioux peoples. As we know, land and territorial acknowledgements are political statements that respectfully recognize Indigenous peoples' continued presence on the lands where we as settlers and immigrants live and work and benefit from. This conference started with a beautiful ceremonial land acknowledgement by Indigenous knowledge keepers. To the elders and to the organizers for that. In Canada, land acknowledgement is also a reminder of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action to redress historical and contemporary injustices. I'm sorry, I suddenly realized, would you be able to share the slides, Olivia, at this point? Thank you. So the next one, please. Most importantly, I see land acknowledgements as an invitation for critical self-reflection for personal, professional, and institutional perspectives as an embodied, healing, lifelong journey full of mistakes, compassion, and discomfort. Next slide, please. Bearing this context in mind, while territorial acknowledgements provide us with one way to recognize the historical relationship between land and peoples, we also need to acknowledge that in contemporary times, this already fraught and uneven relationship between land and peoples is facing yet another contradiction. Given the challenges of food security, rising sea levels, and ecological disruptions, land matters more than ever. At the same time, for a significant number of human beings, mostly urban and conventionally educated or skilled, their perceived connection with land has also become ever more tenuous, since place and location matters even less than before to them. Next slide, please. A product of historical and systemic structures, these disparities in our relationship with land, location, geographies, and economies have intensified in the times of COVID. The disruptions of the pandemic are thus also an opportunity to rethink these unjust structures and practices. To imagine a post-pandemic world requires us to first understand the wider context of the historical trajectory of a political economy built on structural socio-economic inequality and class divisions within and among nations. A hard task that requires us to recognize and acknowledge our own role in propping these structures as individuals, communities, and as nation states. In this talk, therefore, I will first provide the broad contours of the political economy of the pandemic and then explore the possible role of higher education in creating a more just and inclusive society. Before that, though, I need to explain my positionality in terms of my identity and where I stand in relation to the existing dynamics of power and privilege. Since our own unique sets of identities based on ethnicity, class, religion, gender, sexuality, nationality, ability, status, etc., affect our social and political experiences and their outcomes. We also experience our positionality differently in different contexts. In an era where the very definition of work, the economy, as well as community is changing significantly and rapidly, my life and career trajectory are textbook illustrations of how place is becoming irrelevant to studying, working, and participating in family and community life locally and globally. As a critical political economist, though, I am well aware that my class and caste privileges have played a significant role in ensuring the portability of my experience and advantages, and thus my ability to move through and in many spaces. Granddaughter of freedom fighters in the independence movement in India, I was raised in a political and privileged family in India. After finishing my doctorate in international studies from Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi, I began my career in South Africa, and now I live in Canada, as you heard in my bio. My positionality then, as an able-bodied cisgender woman who deals with chronic pain, an academic of color, and an immigrant from a formerly colonized country that is currently facing a crisis of governance, informs my research approaches and teaching methods, as well as the focus of my academic writings and creative works. Broadly, my research examines political processes affecting the conceptualization and manifestation of globalization, which I see as a process along a historical continuum of global movement of humans, ideas, institutions, commodities, and technologies. Following my research and experience thus, I believe that critical inquiry is the most valuable tool for strengthening the institutions and practices of democracy, domestically and internationally, to contribute to just solutions in these times of rising democratic deficits, extreme inequality, and global crises. In this regard, while acknowledging the role of higher education in upholding unjust social power structures, social and political power structures, I see universities and other institutions of higher learning as contested sites where intellectual and transformative work does and must intersect. That is particularly true in the COVID era, which has brought into sharp relief the widening socio-economic inequalities and the heavy burden of historical injustices borne by marginalized groups. So, where are we in terms of this ongoing pandemic? Next slide, please. Scientists have long warned of the increase in the rate and severity of emergent infectious diseases in the wake of global climate change. COVID-19, the latest in this series, is not only taking a massive human toll, as we know, it is also laying bare the deeply disturbing inequalities within and among nations. As the case and death graphs of the coronavirus keeps climbing up, we are seeing many of the same patterns repeating worldwide. Rich countries are experiencing high rates of testing and vaccinations, while poorer countries are struggling with the ballooning costs of the pandemic as well as the economic lockdowns. The two hemispheres, nevertheless, are connected via the shared obstacles of politically driven misinformation and policy inaction. In both rich and poor countries, big business has been raking in mega profits, while smaller businesses are folding up and working class people are losing jobs, livelihoods, and financial security. Next slide, please. Undoubtedly, the effects of the pandemic are also unevenly distributed, not just along geographical or economic lines, but also along gender. Women, non-binary folks, the poor, and the disabled in both the global north and the global south are not only bearing a higher burden of COVID-19 disruptions, but also a much higher burden of its hidden costs. There is substantial evidence of the disproportionate impact of the pandemic in terms of economic losses, severity of health impact, and death on the already marginalized due to the pre-existing structural discriminations, whether it is the highest death rate per 100,000 among Black Americans, or the plight of the daily wage workers in urban India who were forced to walk hundreds of kilometers to their rural homes due to a hastily imposed lockdown. Additionally, we are witnessing an explosion of violence against women and the most severe setback to hard-earned women's rights in many parts of the world. Widespread patterns of women losing their safety, economic power, their autonomy, and the opportunities for their education as they are pushed to the front lines, unprotected, to be sacrificed during the pandemic, have been tied to what Rachel E. Luft defines as racialized disaster patriarchy, an intersectional lens that adds to Naomi Klein's concept of disaster capitalism. We know that most of these trends are continuing, since even before the pandemic, we were witnessing rising inequality, democratic deficits, and polarization. So what's new? Next slide, please. Aside from the political and economic effects of the pandemic, the two long-term trends that are exacerbating these problems are the persistence of historical structural inequities and the challenges of global climate change. The neoliberal response to these short and long-term challenges has been in the form of deficit thinking, which blames the victims for their predicament, shifts attention away from structural and historical reasons, and consequently re-amplifies oppressive and hegemonic structures, policies, and practices. Consequently, instead of creating the conditions of fundamental shifts in the realms of social, political, and economic organization, as historically pandemics have often done, the current responses to the COVID-19 crisis have led to further concentration of power and wealth, unchecked rise of surveillance, diminished democracy, and unraveling social contract around the world in varying degrees. By now, it's clear how unprepared the world was, not only in terms of COVID-19 as a global health emergency, but also in anticipating the impact of inequities and vulnerabilities across all societies. As the economic and political crisis continues to unfold with the ongoing breakdown of supply chains and the exacerbation of alarming social disparity, however, the pandemic era has also shown signs of rupture in the status quo. Next slide, please. The disruptions of COVID-19 have created the conditions for implementing ideas and solutions that were previously deemed impossible. In the realm of social policy, we saw galvanization of debates around the world, from universal healthcare to universal basic income and guaranteed jobs, and in some instances, even implementation of the same, at least for a period. Two good examples of these policy measures from Canada are the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, or CERB, and the Canada Recovery Benefit, CRB, which provided financial support directly to Canadians whose livelihoods were affected by COVID-19. While both these benefits were limited term, they inspired the introduction of Bill C-273, the first ever bill to create the parameters of a national guaranteed basic income in Canada. Unfortunately, the bill was terminated when the 44th general election was called on August 15, 2021. Bill sponsor Julie Zerowich, as well as Trudeau's Liberal Party, have been re-elected, and thus there is still hope for such progressive policy measures that can address deep economic inequities. In terms of the environment, we saw many national and provincial governments roll back environmental regulations during the COVID-19 crisis, taking advantage of this unprecedented public health crisis to sneak through deregulation and suspend the requirement for public consultation and participation before approving projects or laws that could impact the environment. Additionally, as we heard at this conference, the increased use of PPE and other single-use plastic products have aggravated the plastic waste, micro and nanoscale plastic problem, as well as GHS emissions due to their incineration. In some good news, though, NASA noted that between February and November 2020, pandemic restrictions reduced global nitrogen dioxide concentrations by nearly 20%. The drop in all types of emission rates during the lockdowns are clearly short-term, but they prove that it can be done, that human mobility and behavior is incontrovertibly contributing to the climate crisis, and that it is possible to regulate it in the service of ecological conservation. Finally, while the pandemic definitely amplified systemic racism, during the same period, we also witnessed some of the most coordinated acts of protests and solidarity against police brutality and racial injustices. The Black Lives Matter protests following the murders of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and Rayshard Brooks in the mid-2020 caught the world's attention in unprecedented ways. It sparked protests across the US as well as around the world against structural racism. Beyond the US, we saw creative and effective use of social media by anti-racist groups and hacktivists to force conversations that are something of a racial reckoning in social, personal, and academic spaces. Expanding beyond race, in India, despite the steadfast support of the upper caste for the right-wing Hindutva in ideology, these international conversations have helped strengthen the space for anti-caste movement and solidarities among South Asians in India and abroad. And in Canada, along with shining a light on the Black history and experience in Canada, these conversations made non-Indigenous people pay attention to the ongoing indigenous political mobilization and the lack of implementation of the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Excuse me. Historically, the numerous blockades, sit-ins, encampments, and protests by indigenous communities to protect treaty rights and self-governance have been the most significant barriers to unsustainable resource extractions, devastating pollution, and deforestation in the ecologically vulnerable parts of Canada. Despite a long history of nonviolent, disruptive, direct action, and many legal victories against corporate activities on Indigenous lands, the Indigenous communities had lacked the clout to implement these into a leverage to push for Indigenous rights. Starting during the conservative regime, though, Indigenous leaders and activists began to coordinate their activities on an unprecedented nationwide scale. It included grassroots Indigenous activists embarking on ambitious countrywide coordinated action for educating and forging alliances with non-native climate and social justice groups, student associations, and labor unions. During the pandemic, the Wet'suwet'en standoff against a gas pipeline, as well as the Fairy Creek blockade to stop logging in ancient forests, the non-native show of solidarity with the Indigenous communities has been remarkable. It is also an indication that the young members of the burgeoning climate justice movement in Canada finally realize that their liberation is tied to the liberation of the Indigenous peoples. We are yet to see how long the momentum will last and how deep the changes are likely to be, but these hopeful sparks need to be nurtured by those of us with any privilege. As students, scholars, scientists, caregivers, homemakers, entrepreneurs, practitioners, activists, artists, and storytellers, we have the immense privilege of being knowledge keepers and creators. The knowledge industry, however, is intensely political, much like everything else in life. In academia, until very recently, the scholarship on the racialized underpinnings of contemporary institutions and knowledge structures had been largely ignored. As Dr. Lupita Montoya highlighted in her passionate presentation, racism in academia is endemic and institutionally protected. But the material realities of the impact of the pandemic has forced a reckoning with systemic racial disparities in North America. In this moment, then, there is a proliferation of EDI offices at universities and much needed funding for research on structural and historical inequities. But how do we ensure that these measures go beyond tokenism and that education will play a positive role in moving us from crisis to justice in the post-pandemic world? Next slide, please. I believe that institutions of higher learning contradictory space where knowledge systems are colonized but also contested. Across the globe, many universities still function as one of the few remaining spaces in a rapidly privatized world that offers some semblance of a public arena for dialogue and as sites for organizing around issues related to democratic access to higher education and racial, gender, and climate justice. It's also one of the reasons why authoritarian regimes cut public funding for higher education, corporatize their governance, and promote anti-intellectualism. Therefore, I consider institutions of higher learning as sites where intellectual labor and knowledge generation overlap with the practice of thought and action towards the goals of social justice and decolonization. This brings us to the much touted word, decolonization. So, what is decolonization and how do we decolonize education? In the early 20th century, the word decolonization was used to describe nations that achieved political independence from colonial rule. In recent years, the concept of decolonization has been employed to talk about restorative justice, to reverse and remedy the material and cultural violence of colonial structures through direct action. So, on one hand, decolonization aims to dismantle what Kwame Nkrumah referred to as neocolonialism, former colonizers' continuing control on economic, political, educational, and other structures. On the other hand, especially in settler colonial states such as Australia, Canada, South Africa, and the United States, decolonization also manifests as advocacy for the rights of indigenous peoples. Decolonization can create the foundation for a just and inclusive society since colonization is a structure, not an event. Colonization has many material aspects in terms of occupation of lands, theft of peoples, and drain of wealth and resources. Colonization is also structural in terms of determining whose knowledge is privileged, whose voices are heard, and whose lives matter. Thus, a commitment to decolonization essentially recognizes the centrality of colonialism in shaping the world as we experience it today. Finally, filling the gaps in our knowledge is the first step in actively transforming the status quo, not just by collecting evidence for what we know, but by asking what we do not know, why, and how will we change it. Examining our individual and institutional self-constitution in a historical context enables us to understand that the decolonization project affects us all, which is why it translates to land rights in one setting while gender justice in another situation. Decolonization in education can be described as a process of thinking about our intellectual, personal, and political formation in a historical frame to understand political, social, and economic fault lines with the intention of interrogating and dismantling harmful mythologies and falsehoods on which the colonial project relies. This process can only be meaningful, though, if our research, writing, and teaching engages with and applies conceptual insights to contemporary real-world situations, as well as in leading collective, creative, and equitable responses at the individual and community levels. And let's not forget women and non-binary folks in our conversations about decolonization. The racism which portrays a linear development of feminism from the West to the rest is a story for another time that I will not get into now. I will say this, though, that despite the rich and long tradition of feminism in all parts of the world, we continue to see the world with one eye closed. Whether it's in historical narratives, policy design, economic analysis, or scientific research. Indigenous epistemology and feminist pedagogy are inherently interdisciplinary, and thus they provide invaluable tools of analysis and creative ways to engage with real-world problems, including those related to the ongoing climate crisis. These approaches need to be centered in our research, writing, and teaching as critical tools to address the challenges of these uncertain times. Next slide, please. Here, I would also like to add that Indigenous knowledge systems are worldwide. Nearly 500 million Indigenous peoples, representing more than 5,000 cultures, live in over 90 countries around the world. They have shared history of forced assimilation and theft of land. And although they comprise only 6% of the global population, they safeguard 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity. There's nobody is exempt from the world of decolonization in any part of the world, which also involves recognizing the colonial project and our complicity in it. So if you are a researcher or writer, pay attention to those whose voices are missing from the so-called canons. What is considered as scholarship? Why? And how can we include diversity of perspectives? If you are an educator, try to decolonize the curriculum by including the multiple lineages, sources of knowledge, and narratives. And if you are an administrator concerned with the practice of EDI, go beyond just hiring BIPOC colleagues by creating the conditions for the success of your colleagues. Next slide, please. I would like to end this talk by sharing a personal anecdote that reasserts the value of widening our perspective, and it also gives me hope. Sometime in mid-2019, before the pandemic forced physical distancing, I was having a conversation with two friends. My indigenous friend is a man in his early 40s. After experiencing harrowing systemic and lateral violence, he's on a healing journey out of addiction and depression. My white friend is a woman in her late 60s, peace activist and philanthropist, distressed by the current political and environmental disasters around the world. We were talking about the raging wildfires in the interior of the province, the smoke from which was now burning our eyes and smudging our lungs. At the coast, she admitted to feeling hopeless for our survival as a species, to which our indigenous friend said, "I used to think that way until the 1990s happened." She said, "What happened in the 90s? I think at least in the 60s, we had moments of hope for the planet's future. But you are far too young to have lived through that." He said, "In the 90s, my people started waking up. Many of my people started to kick addiction. My relatives started returning to their culture. My life started to turn around. I felt hope for the first time." Then he added, with genuine compassion, "Be patient. Your people might also feel this way one day." I sat with this conversation for a long time. Like most people, I also used to think that our world is going to hell in a handbasket, aided by the institutionalized exploitation of humans and other natural beings. This conversation made me aware of my own inability to see beyond my own positionality. It made me recognize yet again that the mainstream summations of the past, present, and the future of the world, whether from the left or the right perspective, still do not take into account the lived realities of the many millions who live in inner cities, reservations, slums, shanty towns, favelas, refugee camps, etc. The stories of the resilience of the marginalized in the face of systemic exclusions and violence barely feature when we consider so-called global solutions to planetary problems. After all, dystopia is just the dominant groups experiencing what the marginalized have been suffering for far too long. So as we learn and unlearn and relearn in the process of decolonizing our institutions and our minds to work towards a just and inclusive post-pandemic world, I think mistakes will be made, but I also think it's okay to be uncomfortable. It's important to be humble. It's vital to expand our perspectives and to remember that another world is possible. I'd like to end by sharing the last slide with some resources. And if you're interested, I'd be happy to share the actual list, because I'm sure the slideshow will end soon. But thank you for your time. Thank you for listening. And I'd be very happy to answer any questions if you have any for me. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Meenal. We do have some questions in the Q&A.
Mm-hmm.
So the first question is from Greg.
Okay.
And I'll go ahead and read it.
Yes, please. For some reason, I can't see the questions. So yes, please, I would appreciate if you read them.
Okay, sure. So the first question is, wealthy, powerful people who resist decolonization often argue that globalization has many benefits where imperialism has existed throughout human history. How do you respond to them?
Thank you, Greg, for the question. And I agree that globalization has existed, has very old, ancient heritage, because as a species, I believe that we are a restless species. We may have originated in Africa and may have spread to all parts of the world, but we've continued to do that forever. So yes, globalization is not new. The movement of people and ideas and flora and fauna is not new. I believe what is new is in the ways colonization as a structure has taken over the world in the last 300-400 years. That is what is new. So I don't like to kind of paint globalization with this brush of, something evil that's happening. I think we have to cast a very nuanced look at what is globalization. There are so many aspects of globalization. There are some really good things with globalization in terms of increasing opportunities for creative solutions and connecting people. And at the same time, there are certain things that globalization enables, which entrenches systemic exploitation and violence. So instead of seeing globalization as either good or bad, I think it's really important for us to see which aspects of globalization, which practices within globalization need to be looked at in terms of its impact on cohesiveness and the possibility of justice and sustainability. Does that answer your question, Greg?
Sure, it does. And if he has another, I'm sure he will ask. So we have a second question. This comes from Lancis representative, and it says, how can we raise the voice from the ones that are against a system that is very well established like capitalism? In Mexico, we get killed. It's very sad. I think there are localized solutions and not global.
Yes, and I totally agree. It's a very dangerous times for those of us who are trying to raise our voices. At the same time, it's also a time filled with a lot of opportunities to raise our voices. I do feel that there is a kind of democratization of media. As much as social media has these incredible ills in terms of how it amplifies misinformation and divisiveness and polarization, at the same time, it has also given us a tool to connect people and causes and coordinate action, direct action, as well as education. So I feel that given that we do have some avenues, it gives me hope that we do have avenues to bring about some change. Like I said in my talk as well, that we do have to be careful in terms of, not careful, we do have to be mindful of the fact that if we have a privilege, we need to spend it. If we have a platform, we need to use it not just to say what we want to say, but also to make space for those who need to be heard, who need to be, who are doing the right thing, who are trying to work towards causes that matter. So it's kind of, I'm not giving you a real answer because I don't have a real answer. What I'm trying to say here is that recognizing that there are a number of real dangers involved in doing this work, at the same time to also recognize that there are, even though very small, that there are avenues that are open, and for us to use them as much as possible, not just for ourselves, but also for our colleagues who are working in these areas. I know it's a very sort of unsatisfactory answer because I feel that way as well, but I'm kind of trying to grab onto whatever little glimmer of hope we have. I mean, for my own work, I have felt threatened, directly and indirectly. But at the same time, I also realize that I have certain privileges that allow me to continue to do this work. But yes, I have to be very mindful of where do I have the space to push and where do I not have the space to push. So I have that luxury. But yes, I understand a lot of my colleagues don't have that luxury. The ones who are stuck in authoritarian regimes don't have that luxury. So all I can say is that I just hope that whatever little space we have to work in, that we can use it and keep expanding that space. Sorry if I sounded very wishy-washy.
Thank you, Meenal. Okay, we have another question found in the chat that says, do you not think that colonization continues through the millions of refugees dependent on colonizers' aid?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And it's not just refugees. Colonization continues in a variety of forms in terms of what is happening through sometimes even international institutions, the insistence on certain rules that don't that actually disadvantage countries, or I should say poorer countries that are still struggling to find a footing in the international system. So neocolonialism, as it is called by some, it continues in many forms. And yes, refugees, migrants are at probably one of the worst receiving ends. But it has many facets. It continues in a variety of ways in political, social, cultural, and economic terms.
Thank you. And it looks like we have one more question.
Okay.
How can activists from different movements, such as climate change and the women's movement, work together for the success of both causes? And what would that look like on a policy agenda?
That's a very good question. And I think that is what is needed. We need to create these, we have to translate these intersectionalities into more collaboration, more cooperation, more talking across causes. And some of that I am seeing happening. Like I mentioned, the changes that I'm seeing in how the indigenous movement here is attracting the solidarity of climate justice movement and other social justice causes here in Canada. This is, looking at the history of how indigenous mobilization has been, or the relationship of indigenous mobilization with environmentalists here in Canada, this is a major shift in their relationship. They used to be on almost like two sides of the camp. There were a number of environmental movements seem to be talking about environment minus the people, in the 90s, for instance, here in Canada. But that has shifted quite a bit in the last little while. And like I said, the pandemic has apparently quite, unexpectedly created a kind of an opening of the possibilities of collaboration and of kind of joining across causes and so on. So I do feel that is possible, seeing what is happening around the world. This is already happening, is what I'm trying to say. But yes, if we consciously work to build it, we definitely are likely to see much more success in terms of pushing for policy change, at all kinds of levels, from city levels to provincial to federal levels. So yes, working towards that is something that I would encourage. Finding common ground is something that we need to work towards. And like I said, I feel hopeful because I feel that it is already happening on at least, in some contexts. But again, it depends on, your location as well. Where are you located and how much room there is for you to do that kind of thing, right? I don't know if I answered that question either.
You did. Thank you. All right. I don't see any other questions, but I want to give people a few more seconds because I would love to hear you talk more. So I would like to see some more questions flood in from the audience. So we'll give them just a few more seconds.
Sure. Also, if anybody is interested, I'd be happy to share the list of resources so they can maybe contact you and you, Olivia, and then they can have that list if anybody wants.
That's perfect. And in fact, if there are no more questions, we have about 12 more minutes until we will move into the sessions room. And I think this would be a good time for us to go to the networking room and perhaps meet you there, at least some of the audience members, and we can continue the chat there.
Sure.
Oh, we have a question. It just popped up.
Oh, we do.
Okay, so this question comes from Lancis, and it asks, do you have a program like that a student we can visit you? Do you have a program that like a student we can visit you?
Yes. Well, so I work for an open and distance university, which means that our students, we don't have a student campus. We do have administrative buildings and so on. And I work from a home office. You can kind of see now that dawn is breaking, you can kind of see behind me the garden shed. But yes, we do have a number of programs and degree programs, if that's what you meant. And in terms of engagement with the kind of research I do, you can definitely drop me a line, send me an email. I'm in the public domain, so you just have to Google my name, or I'm sure Olivia can share it with you. But yes, there are some really very cutting edge programs and courses that Athabasca University offers, which is why I feel very grateful to be working at a university like Athabasca, where it's possible to do this kind of work and feel supported. Because as we heard at this conference, if you don't have that space to do this kind of work, it's very difficult. It's a constant battle to just do this work. And on top of that, if your university is not supportive or if your employer is not supportive, then it just makes it nearly impossible. So Athabasca University does have that, that kind of social justice orientation, both in terms of it being an employer, but of course also in terms of it being a university. So a lot of our programs have that bent, that social justice bent. So yeah, I invite you to go to the website of Athabasca University and check out our programs and courses, and definitely connect with me, drop me a line, and I'd be happy to talk further.
Thank you so very much, Meenal. And do you have any closing notes that you would like to add?
Well, all I would like to say is that I've really enjoyed this conference so far. I'm sorry I was in and out a little bit because there were other things happening. But I have missed the fact of, being, in a room and during coffee breaks and lunch breaks. Of course, that hasn't quite happened because of the virtual nature. But at the same time, I feel on some level, it's actually a lot more accessible because, given not just the pandemic, but also concerns with carbon footprint and workloads and all kinds of other things, I feel that in some ways, I hope we can kind of keep this format, at least in a hybrid form, even once people are traveling more and hopefully the pandemic is over. So yes, I've really enjoyed the conference, and I really thank you, Olivia, for doing such an amazing amount of work. And your work ethic and your hard work is what is making this go so smoothly and so well. So thank you to you, and all the audience and all the presenters. And I look forward for us to continue this conversation, because obviously today is the last day, but this isn't the last session. So I look forward to meeting with some of you virtually and talking more.
Thank you so much, Meenal. Thank you for your keynote. All right, everyone. A round of applause virtually for Meenal. And we will see you in the next session room at 10 a.m. CDT time. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Bye, everyone.